A mother abandoned her son at an orphanage and left with her new partner. Years later, a young man knocked on her door and... The rain poured relentlessly over the empty streets as the black car moved slowly, its headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Inside the vehicle, Helen gripped the steering wheel tightly, her hands shaking and tears streaming down her cheeks. She had spent the entire night battling with her conscience, desperately wishing she could find another way, but the decision had already been made. In front of her, the orphanage building loomed grey and grim, like an ominous reminder of what she was about to do. Ethan, sitting restlessly in the back seat, fidgeted nervously. He was only 5 years old, and his small body barely took up any space on the leather seat. Yet the weight of what was happening filled the entire car. He looked at his mother with big, curious eyes, not understanding why her face was so sad, why her hands trembled, and why she wasn't smiling like she used to. "Mummy, where are we?" he asked, his small voice echoing inside the car, pure and innocent. Helen took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. It wasn't the first time he'd asked that question, but this time she didn't know how to answer. She looked at her son through the rearview mirror, her eyes reflecting indescribable pain. She tried to smile, but her lips only managed a broken twitch. "It's just a place where you'll have to stay for a little while," she said, struggling to sound calm, but her voice cracked at the end. "And you? Are you staying with me, Mummy?" Helen's heart tightened. Her chest felt as if an invisible hand was squeezing it. Words got stuck in her throat, guilt and fear suffocating her. She parked the car in front of the orphanage's entrance and turned off the engine. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. William had threatened her, reminding her that if she didn't leave the child behind, he would personally take care of the problem. And she knew exactly what that meant. William never left loose ends. "Mummy has to leave for a while," she whispered, fighting to maintain control. "But I promise I'll come back for you. I promise." But even as she said those words, Helen knew they weren't true. She knew that by leaving him here, she was condemning him to an uncertain fate. She opened the car door and walked to the back seat, where Ethan was still watching her with those big eyes full of trust. She unbuckled the seatbelt with trembling hands and lifted him in her arms, feeling the warmth of his small body for the last time. The sky seemed to weep with them as they crossed the orphanage threshold. Up close, the building was even more dismal. Dusty windows, crumbling walls, and a front yard overrun with weeds. It looked like a place where hope came to die. Helen forced herself to move forward, each step sinking her deeper into the agony. "Is this a place for kids, Mommy?" Ethan asked as he looked around, curious but not afraid. "Yes, honey," Helen replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Just for a while." The door creaked open, revealing a stern-faced woman with grey hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked at Helen with disapproval, as if she knew exactly what kind of mother would bring her child to such a place. "Is it him?" the woman asked bluntly, ignoring Ethan completely. "Yes. He's my son." Helen couldn't stop her voice from breaking. She whispered the last words as if speaking that truth would condemn her forever. "Good." The woman bent down to look at Ethan, who stared back at her with a curious expression. "Come along, little one. I'll show you where you'll be sleeping." Ethan turned to his mother, waiting for her to say something, to take his hand and tell him everything would be fine. But Helen just stood there, tears welling up in her eyes, trembling from head to toe. "Mommy," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible, taking a small step toward her. Helen knelt down to his level and hugged him tightly, with more desperation than she had ever felt in her life. It was as if she were trying to memorize every second, the scent of his hair, the beat of his tiny heart. Time seemed to stop, but it was just a moment. "I promise you'll be okay," she whispered in his ear, her voice breaking with every word. "Be strong, Ethan. Never forget how much I love you." Then she abruptly pulled away, as if letting him go was the only thing keeping her alive. The woman from the orphanage took Ethan's hand and led him inside, while he kept looking back, searching for his mother's face. "Mommy!" he cried as the door began to close. His small body tried to run toward her, but the woman held him firmly. Helen couldn't bear it. She stepped back, then again, until she finally turned around and ran to the car, her sobs echoing in the cold morning. She started the car with trembling hands and drove away quickly as her son's voice faded in the distance. Ethan, standing on the doorstep, watched the black car disappear into the fog. His small lips tightened in a trembling line, and the tears began to fall. But he made no noise. He didn't cry out loud. He stood there, motionless, with his hand still raised in the air, waiting for his mother to turn around, waiting for her to come back. But she didn't. That day, Ethan's heart broke in silence. His mother's promise to return was all he had left. The seasons dragged slowly at the orphanage, as if time itself was trapped in an endless cycle of grey days and sleepless nights. Ethan's first winter in that place was harsh. The cold seeped through the crumbling walls and seemed to settle deep into his small frame. But even on the coldest nights, it wasn't the chill that made him shiver. It was the loneliness. At just 5 years old, Ethan had arrived with a small backpack filled with clothes and an old stuffed rabbit his mother had given him before everything fell apart. During the first weeks, whenever he felt the weight of loneliness tighten around his chest, he would cling to that stuffed animal as if it were the only piece of her he had left. At first, he still hoped to see her walk through the door, her face lit by that warm smile he longed for. He imagined her telling him it was all a misunderstanding, that she would take him back home, and none of this would ever happen again. But the days turned into weeks, and then into months. That door never opened for him. The orphanage, a gloomy and oppressive place, seemed to drain the light and hope from anyone who entered. The caregivers, while not cruel, had neither the time nor the energy to pay attention to every child who arrived with their own story of abandonment. There were too many mouths to feed, and too few hands to do it. The staff tried to keep things under control, but indifference had become a shield to protect themselves from the pain of watching so many children pass through, some temporarily, others for years. The older children moved like silent shadows, accepting their fate with a resignation that frightened Ethan. Some picked on the new arrivals, testing if they were strong enough to survive the harsh environment. At first, Ethan was one of their targets. They called him the crybaby, because no matter how hard he tried to hold back, the tears always found a way to escape during the nights. They pushed him, took his food, and laughed when he tried to fight back. But then, one day, Miguel appeared. Miguel was 8, just 3 years older than Ethan, but in the orphanage, that age difference made him seem much older. He had messy hair and a determined gaze, like someone who had seen far more than a child should. He stepped between Ethan and the older kids who were bullying him. With a mix of calm and firmness, he stared at them and told them to leave Ethan alone. The others backed down, not because Miguel was stronger, but because they knew he was someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to anyone. From that day on, he became the only source of support for Ethan, a kind of older brother in a place where the word family was a distant and foreign concept. "You can't show weakness here," Miguel told him one afternoon as they sat in a quiet corner of the yard, a spot where the others rarely went. "If they see you cry, they'll keep doing it. You have to learn to hide the pain, at least until you're alone." Ethan nodded slowly, not fully understanding. But Miguel's presence gave him a small sense of security. For the first time since arriving at the orphanage, he didn't feel completely alone. Miguel taught him the unspoken rules of the place, how to move without drawing attention, how to identify the caregivers with kind hearts and those who were just waiting for a mistake to punish them. He showed him the spots to hide when he needed a moment alone and the ways to become invisible when the bigger kids were looking for trouble. Over time, Ethan grew more reserved, more observant. He watched as other children arrived with the same hopeful look he once had, and how, little by little, that light faded from their eyes. Some, the lucky ones, were adopted by families who promised to give them a home. But Ethan wasn't one of those kids. His name was never called, his hand never taken to walk out that door into a new life. The adoption letters were like a ritual at the orphanage. They gathered in the dining hall silently while the director read the names of the children who would be adopted. Each time a name was called, the child would step forward, trembling with excitement and fear, and the rest would clap weakly. Each time a letter was announced and it wasn't his, Ethan felt a small pang in his chest, as if the world were reminding him that he wasn't special enough to be chosen. One morning, everything changed for Ethan. Miguel's name was called. The director read his name with the same indifference as always, and Miguel, eyes wide, stood up slowly. Ethan watched him in silence, his heart pounding. Miguel was the only one who had protected him, the only friend he had known in that place. Miguel glanced at him, a mix of surprise and sadness in his eyes. "I told you," Miguel murmured, leaning toward him before leaving. "In this place, no one stays forever." Ethan wanted to scream, to beg him not to leave, but he bit his tongue. He couldn't show weakness. He couldn't be the crybaby again. He stood there, his hands trembling, watching as his friend walked out the door, silently promising he would come back someday. But days passed, and Miguel never returned. It was at that moment Ethan understood a devastating truth. Promises at the orphanage shattered as easily as glass. The following months were even harder. Now, without Miguel's protection, the other kids came back to torment him, mocking him for believing he had a real friend. Instead of responding, Ethan chose to remain silent. He learned to observe quietly, to hide his pain behind a mask of indifference. Slowly, the child who had once been so open and vulnerable became just another shadow in the orphanage's dim corridors. The nights became endless. He would curl up under the thin blankets of his bed, clutching his now old and worn-out stuffed rabbit as if it were his only link to the outside world. Sometimes, when he was sure no one could hear him, he would whisper his mother's name, a word that, with time, lost all its meaning. Time changed him. He stopped glancing hopefully at the orphanage's door, stopped searching for familiar faces among the adults who came to visit. He no longer wanted to be chosen. He no longer waited for his mother to return. His mother's promise of coming back had been replaced by the weight of reality. She wasn't coming back. No one would. With each passing day, Ethan sank deeper into that silent acceptance. The orphanage wasn't just a place he lived. It was an emotional prison where his dreams slowly faded. But even in the darkness, a tiny spark of hope remained, buried deep inside. A spark that would only ignite many years later, when the truth about his past finally came to light. For now, Ethan simply survived. And in the orphanage, that was the only thing he could do. The sun hid behind the clouds that autumn morning when an old van pulled up in front of the orphanage. The director appeared at the door, wearing her usual stern expression, holding a folder of documents disdainfully in one hand. Ethan watched the scene from the dining hall without much expectation. His heart no longer raced as it once did whenever a car approached. He no longer believed it could be for him, or that someone would come to take him to a home. But that day was different. His name was finally called. "Ethan, pack your things." The director's voice echoed, sharp and emotionless. The children around him looked up, some curious, others simply resigned to seeing yet another face disappear from the orphanage's grey halls. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what to do at first. Was this real or a mistake? With trembling hands, he ran to his room. He grabbed the small backpack he had carried since he arrived, the same one his mother had left him with, now older and more worn out. Inside were just a few clothes and the stuffed rabbit, his only constant companion through all these years. He took a deep breath and stepped out with the backpack slung over his shoulder. The director led him to the door, where a middle-aged couple was waiting. The woman had a serious expression, her blonde hair carefully tied back in a bun. The man, his face stern, looked at him without a hint of emotion. Neither smiled Neither reached out to embrace him. They just stared at him, as if they were evaluating a piece of merchandise. "This is Ethan," the director said, almost with a tone of disdain. "He's 12 years old. He hasn't had any serious behavioral issues, but he's reserved." The woman nodded slowly and looked at Ethan as if she were deciding whether to accept him or not. Ethan held her gaze, remembering Miguel's words. "Don't show weakness." He stood still, the stuffed rabbit peeking out of his backpack, waiting for them to say something. "We'll take him," the woman finally replied, her voice dry. That's how Ethan left the orphanage for the first time in 7 years. But he didn't leave with excitement or hope. Something inside him knew that this wouldn't be a home. It would simply be a different place to exist. The foster home was in a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The white facade, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the perfectly painted fence gave the appearance of an ideal home. But none of that mattered to Ethan. As he crossed the front door, a heavy feeling settled in his stomach. The silence was overwhelming. There were no laughs or conversations, only the echo of his steps on the polished wooden floor. "Your room is upstairs, at the end of the hall," the woman instructed, not bothering to introduce herself. Then she turned toward the kitchen without another word, leaving Ethan alone in the hallway. Ethan climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. The room they had given him was small and empty, except for a single bed and a bare wardrobe. There were no toys, no photos, not even curtains on the windows. He placed his backpack on the bed, took out his stuffed rabbit, and laid it on the pillow. The only splash of color in a cold, lifeless room. That first night, fear of the unknown took hold of him. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the rabbit clutched tightly in his arms. He could hear the couple talking quietly downstairs, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. They didn't try to approach him, didn't say goodnight, and certainly didn't make him feel welcome. The house felt like an elegant prison, with walls of perfect appearance and doors closed with the sound of silence. The following days blurred into a haze of indifference. The routine was strict: wake up early, eat breakfast in silence, head to school, and come straight back home. There was no time for friends or activities. His foster parents, who barely spoke to him, seemed more interested in maintaining order than in getting to know him. Everything was calculated, cold. "If you behave, you can stay here until you're old enough," the woman said one night during dinner, not even looking at him. Ethan nodded, but inside he felt a chilling emptiness. Stay until I'm older. Was that the best he could hope for? It was during those first weeks that he met Javier. Javier was another kid in the foster system, a year older than Ethan. They met at school when they were paired together by their science teacher for a project. Javier had a defiant attitude and a smile that never reached his eyes. It was obvious from miles away that he didn't trust anyone. "So, another one from the system?" Javier said the first day, sizing him up. "Yeah," Ethan answered, not knowing what else to say. "Here's a tip," Javier whispered as he leaned in, making sure no one else could hear. "Don't expect anything from adults. They'll only let you down." Ethan felt an instant connection with him. Javier was like him, broken, but in a way that wasn't visible at first glance. Soon they started spending more time together, both in and out of school. Javier showed him how to sneak out of the house without being noticed, how to move around the city without drawing attention, and where to hide when he needed a place to think. The late-night escapes became their little refuge. They would go out after midnight, when the lights of the houses were off and the city was asleep. They roamed the alleys and sat on park benches, sharing stories of the various foster homes they had been through. Ethan learned that Javier had also been abandoned at a young age, but unlike him, Javier had no desire to find his biological family. "Why would you want to find her?" Javier asked one night, the full moon casting shadows on their faces. "If they left you, it's because they didn't want you. Accept it." "Maybe. But I want to know why," Ethan answered, his voice barely a whisper. Javier scoffed, shaking his head in disdain. "That question won't lead you anywhere good." But Ethan couldn't help it. Every time he thought about his mother, the desire for answers grew. Why did she leave him? What made her make that choice? And most importantly, did she ever think about him? As the months passed, his foster family grew tired of his distant behavior. Ethan skipped school, came home late, and spent more time with Javier than with them. The tension grew day by day, until one night his foster mother snapped. "I can't take it anymore," she yelled, her eyes filled with frustration. "He doesn't want to fit in. He doesn't follow the rules. We're not a prison, Ethan." Ethan stayed silent, his fists clenched. He had promised himself he wouldn't cry, not in front of them. "We can't keep him," the man said finally, his tone resigned. Ethan felt a void opening up inside him. Another home, another abandonment. Not again, he thought bitterly. A few weeks later, he was moved to a new home. But this time, he left nothing behind. The stuffed rabbit stayed on the pillow in his old room, forgotten. He had come to the conclusion that he didn't need anything to tie him to a place. He didn't need belongings, temporary homes, or broken promises. All he needed were answers. And someday, he would find them. For now, he would just survive, as he always had. The leaves crunched under his feet as Ethan walked along the path covered in gold and red. The crisp October air blew hard, tousling his hair and sending chills down his spine, but he didn't care. His life had been a whirlwind of changes in recent months, and the shifting seasons only mirrored the uncertainty that surrounded him. When they told him he'd be moved to another foster home, he felt a deep emptiness, but he wasn't surprised. The days with the previous family had grown more tense, and the constant clashes had led to an inevitable breaking point. He had convinced himself that nothing could affect him anymore. But when they took him to the new home, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of resentment and hopelessness. This foster home was located on the outskirts of the city, in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by fields. The red brick facade and the small front garden made it seem welcoming, almost like the typical family house one sees in movies. However, Ethan knew appearances could be deceiving. He had been to too many places like this, and they all turned out to be traps of false promises and fake smiles. The woman who opened the door had a warm look in her eyes and a kind smile. She introduced herself as Anna, the foster mother, and gently guided him inside. Anna seemed different from the other people he had met in the foster care system. She moved patiently, as if every step Ethan took, every word he didn't say, genuinely mattered to her. "This will be your room, Ethan," she said softly, as she showed him a small room with walls painted in a soft blue and shelves filled with children's books. There was a single bed covered with a checkered comforter and a small reading lamp in the corner. Ethan stood still in the doorway, taking everything in silently. After so much time in the system, he had learned not to react, not to get caught up in the illusion of a place that might be his own. "You don't have to say anything," Anna continued, noticing his stiffness. "I just want you to know that this is your home for as long as you want it to be." Ethan didn't respond. His eyes scanned the room, but lingered on the door, as if he expected it to slam shut at any moment, trapping him in yet another cage disguised as a home. "Do you like to read?" Anna asked, gesturing to the shelves. Ethan shook his head slowly, even though he knew it wasn't true. At the orphanage, he used to devour books to escape reality, but now reading felt like a luxury from the past, something that belonged to a more innocent version of himself. Anna offered him an understanding smile and left the room, leaving him alone. As the door closed softly, Ethan collapsed onto the bed, burying his head in the pillow. There was a warmth in the house that felt foreign to him, and it made him uneasy. It was easier to adjust to hostile places, where the pain was clear and tangible. But in this place, the pain was hidden behind a facade of tranquility. The first few weeks passed with a tense calm. Anna was patient and attentive, but not intrusive. She didn't try to force conversations or get information out of him, something Ethan appreciated. The man she lived with, who introduced himself as Jaime, was more distant but showed no hostility. He simply observed from afar, as if trying to give Ethan space to settle in. At night, Anna would often sit with him in the living room, quietly reading a book while he did the same, or pretended to watch TV. It was a routine that slowly became less uncomfortable. Sometimes, without realizing it, Ethan found himself glancing at her, wondering if this calmness was genuine. But then, he forced himself to look away, reminding himself that nothing in this place was permanent. Everything changed one night when Anna caught him in the kitchen. Ethan had gotten up late, as he usually did, to wander around the house in silence. He liked those moments, when the world slept, and he could roam freely, unseen, without anyone expecting anything from him. But that night, he found Anna in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea in her hand, staring absent-mindedly at the steam rising from it. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, without looking up. Ethan froze in the doorway. He was used to being invisible, to going unnoticed, but Anna had noticed him. "I get that sometimes too," she continued. "There are nights when the silence feels too loud." Ethan frowned. He didn't know how to respond, so he just stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his pajamas. "Would you like some tea?" she offered, nodding toward the teapot. Ethan shook his head, but his feet, almost of their own accord, carried him to the table. He sat down across from her, feeling strangely exposed. "Sometimes I wonder what things would be like if they were different," murmured Anna, speaking more to herself than to him. "If I had made different choices, if I had had the courage to fight for what I wanted." Ethan blinked, surprised. He had never heard an adult speak like that, with such honesty and vulnerability. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly, feeling a knot forming in his chest. Anna looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a soft sadness. "Because I want you to know that here, you can be whoever you want to be, Ethan. You don't have to be the strong boy who always has everything under control. Not with me." Ethan lowered his gaze, feeling a weight in his chest that he didn't quite understand. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. No one had ever given him permission to be weak, to show his true pain. But instead of feeling relieved, anger swirled inside him. "And what happens when I decide to leave?" he snapped, his voice dripping with resentment. "Because that's what's going to happen, right? In the end, all of this will end." He looked up, eyes blazing with defiance. "So, why pretend that you care?" Anna didn't flinch. She just looked at him with compassion. "It's not pretending, Ethan. But I understand why you think that." She took a sip of her tea, her voice so calm it nearly drove him mad. "I just hope that one day, if you decide to leave, you'll know you always have a place to come back to." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, struggling not to shout. That calmness, that patience. It made him want to scream, to hit something, to show her that he didn't need her pity. But at the same time, something inside him wished she was right. That night, when he went to bed, he couldn't sleep. Anna's words echoed in his mind over and over again, like a refrain he couldn't drown out. "You'll always have a place to come back to." The following months passed with a tense calm. Ethan still kept his distance, but something had shifted inside him. He began to participate more in conversations, to respond to Anna's questions with one-word answers, and on rare occasions, to talk about things that weren't superficial. However, he never stopped waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. The day Javier showed up at the school gate with a black eye and a defiant grin, Ethan knew his world was about to crumble again. "Hey, buddy," Javier greeted, his carefree attitude unchanged. "Have you gone soft living with that woman?" Ethan shook his head, but Javier caught the hesitation in his eyes. "I knew it. You're letting your guard down." Javier gave him a light shove on the shoulder. "But don't worry. I know how to toughen you up again." From that moment on, the late-night escapades with Javier started again. They returned to the streets, to the dark corners where no one could see them, doing things they knew they shouldn't be doing. But Ethan couldn't stop. He needed to prove that he was still the same, that he wasn't being absorbed by the false sense of security Anna was trying to give him. When Anna found out, it was the first time Ethan saw her lose her composure. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" she asked, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Is it so hard to accept that someone wants you here?" Ethan couldn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her with clenched fists and a pounding heart. Finally, a month later, the social workers decided it was no longer viable to keep him there. The home, no matter how hard Anna tried, couldn't hold on to a boy who didn't want to stay. The day he left, Anna handed him a small envelope. "Here's my address and number," she said, her voice trembling. "If you ever decide to come back, or if you just want to talk, don't hesitate to call." She gave him a sad smile. "Please, take care of yourself, Ethan." Ethan took the envelope without meeting her eyes and climbed into the car that would take him to his next destination. As Anna's house faded into the distance, he felt a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away. Maybe, someday. But no. He couldn't allow himself that hope. Once again, he promised himself never to trust anyone again. The early morning wind cut like a knife as Ethan stood in front of the abandoned building that had once been his home. The orphanage looked even more run down than he remembered. Shattered windows, crumbling walls, and a front door covered in dust and rust. Everything was in ruins, a reflection of what he had felt inside for so many years. At 18, his hair tousled by the wind and his worn-out jacket pulled tightly around him, Ethan looked at the place with a mix of nostalgia and bitterness. He had aged out of the foster system just a few months ago, and every day outside that environment had been a struggle to find his place in the world. But he wasn't here to reminisce about his lost childhood. He was here for answers. His mother, Helen. That blurry, elusive figure who had shaped his life in so many ways that even he didn't fully understand. Throughout all these years, the pain of her abandonment had turned into a corrosive anger that drove him forward. He needed to know the truth. He needed to know why she had left him and what kind of life she had built after getting rid of him. When he finally found the courage to step inside the old orphanage, the whole place seemed smaller than he remembered. The low ceilings and narrow hallways that had seemed endless when he was a child now felt oppressive and closed in. But the weight he felt wasn't just physical. It was as if the past seeped through the walls, reminding him of the pain and loneliness he had endured. "Who are you?" A rough voice jolted him out of his thoughts. Ethan turned and found an elderly woman watching him with suspicion from the entrance of the main hall. Her grey hair was unkempt, and her thin figure hunched as if bearing the weight of a lifetime. She wore a dirty apron, and her hands were stained with dust. "My name is Ethan," he replied, trying to sound as firm as he could. "I grew up here, many years ago." The woman squinted, trying to recognize him, but it was clear she didn't remember the hundreds of children who had passed through that place. "What do you want?" she asked suspiciously. Ethan pulled out a folded photo from his pocket. It was the only picture he had of himself and his mother, taken on his 3rd birthday. In the image, Helen was hugging him with a radiant smile, a smile Ethan could barely associate with the woman who had abandoned him. He extended the photo toward the woman. "I'm looking for my mother." The words came out in a choked whisper, filled with contained emotion. "Her name is Helen. Helen Matthews. She left me here when I was 5. Do you know anything about her?" The woman examined the photo closely, frowning. Then she sighed and shook her head. "It's been a long time since I stopped paying attention to those names, but I vaguely remember that the woman who brought that child, you, was with a man, a tall, elegant man. He didn't look like the typical father or guardian. He was someone different." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. That man, it had to be him. The same man who had been present in every one of his vague, fragmented memories. The same man he had begun to associate with the darkness of his past. "Do you remember his name?" Ethan asked, his voice more desperate than he would have liked. The woman paused, then nodded slowly. "William. His name was William. He never said his last name, but it wasn't hard to see that he had control." She looked at him intently. "If you're looking for your mother, boy, start with him. But be careful. That man is not someone you should mess with." Ethan clenched his fists. William. That name fit the shadow that had haunted his thoughts throughout his life. The man who, somehow, had influenced his mother's decision to leave him. The man who must hold the key to understanding what really happened. The next step in his search took him deep into old files and records. He spent hours in libraries and archive offices, sifting through dusty documents that hadn't been touched in years. Frustration grew with each passing day, but Ethan didn't give up. He couldn't afford to stop now. One afternoon, after hours of fruitless searching, he found something. An old court document in which William's name appeared alongside his mother's. It was a report of a revoked restraining order. Ethan's skin crawled as he read the details. Helen had sought protection from William. The document described a pattern of control and emotional manipulation that William exerted over her. But the request had been denied due to lack of evidence. There were no specific details of violence, only a general statement of emotional coercion. The judge had dismissed it. Helen, without legal or familial support, had been trapped under William's influence. Ethan felt a fire ignite within him. All his hatred, all the anger he had contained for years, now had a clear target. William had not only destroyed his mother's life, he had also destroyed his. The next step was to track down William. He started with the names associated with him in the files, then moved on to searching commercial records and public databases. What he found was unsettling. William was not just a powerful man, he was an influential businessman with connections in various spheres of society. He had operated in the shadows, keeping a low profile while extending his control over vulnerable people. Every thread he pulled led to more dark secrets, shady businesses, hidden properties, and a web of influence that stretched beyond what Ethan had imagined. But all that power did not intimidate Ethan. On the contrary, it filled him with determination. It was then that he decided to seek help. He found Philip, an experienced lawyer who had worked on cases of abuse and manipulation. Philip had heard of William before, but had never been able to catch him legally. He was hesitant at first, but Ethan's story moved him. "You're playing with fire, kid," Philip warned one night as they reviewed documents in his small office. "This man has connections everywhere. If you're going to confront him, you need more than just courage." "I don't care about the danger," Ethan replied fiercely. "I won't stop until I find my mother and free her from that man." Philip watched him in silence for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Then I'll help you. But you need to understand something. If we do this, there's no turning back." Ethan held Philip's gaze, his heart pounding. "I don't want to go back." The words came out with a steel edge. "I want to destroy him." They began to investigate together, gathering evidence and connecting loose threads. Each discovery revealed a new layer of William's corruption, the people he had manipulated, the lives he had destroyed. But the real shock came when they found a financial document showing that William was still in contact with Helen. Ethan could hardly believe it. All those years, his mother hadn't disappeared as he thought. She had been under William's control all along. Anger and desperation churned in his chest. "This is bigger than we thought," murmured Philip, studying the document with a grim expression. "If William still has her under his control, it could be dangerous to try and approach her without alerting him." Ethan knew he had to be careful, but that didn't matter to him. He just wanted to see her. He wanted to hear her side of the story, look her in the eyes, and ask her why. The chapter ends with Ethan making a dangerous decision. He is going to find William and confront him, no matter the cost. But what he doesn't yet know is that his search will lead him to face much darker and deeper truths than he ever imagined. The search has begun, and it won't stop until he gets the answers he longs for. Ethan sat in a small, discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Sunlight streamed through the windows, creating irregular patterns on the worn wooden tables. As he stared at his nearly empty coffee cup, his mind kept replaying every detail of what he had discovered. William was still in contact with his mother. She was out there, trapped in the shadow of this man, and every second he remained inactive was another second she stayed a prisoner. "Are you sure about this?" Philip's deep voice pulled him from his thoughts. The lawyer sat across from him, hands clasped and dark eyes filled with concern. They had spent weeks gathering information, and the picture painted by the evidence was disturbing. William was not just an influential man. He was a master manipulator. He controlled people through a network of favors, threats, and blackmail, moving with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. But Ethan was more determined than ever. "I'm going to find her," he replied, his voice steady. "And if William tries to stop me, I'll confront him, no matter the cost." Philip watched him in silence for a long moment, as if evaluating whether there was anything he could say to dissuade him. But finally, he let out a sigh of resignation. "Then I have someone I want you to meet," he said, his tone serious. "She went through the same thing your mother did. She was manipulated, controlled, but she managed to escape. Maybe she can help you understand what Helen is facing, and together you might find a way to free her without William seeing you coming." Ethan blinked, surprised. Until that moment, he hadn't considered the possibility that there were others in the same situation as his mother. The idea that someone else might have suffered the same pain left him bewildered. Who was she? How deep was William's influence? "Her name is Charlotte," Philip added. "She's been trying to expose William for years, but her testimony alone hasn't been enough. She needs evidence, and if you team up with her, both of you will have more strength to confront him." Ethan hesitated for a moment. Could he really trust someone else? He had spent so long acting alone, relying solely on his instincts and his own strength, that the idea of teaming up with someone made him uneasy. But if she had survived William, maybe she could understand better than anyone. "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "I'll meet her." The meeting place was a secluded park, surrounded by tall trees that filtered the afternoon light, creating an atmosphere of shadows and golden glimmers. Philip led him to a bench at the end of the path, where a young woman sat with her head bowed, her long brown hair hiding her face. She wore a dark jacket and worn jeans, and her hands nervously played with the edge of her scarf. "Charlotte, this is Ethan," Philip announced gently. The young woman lifted her head and looked at him with intense green eyes that reflected a mix of sadness and strength. There was something in her gaze that made Ethan feel exposed, as if she could see through all his barriers. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, he felt an instant connection. It was as if they shared a pain that only they could understand. "Hello, Ethan," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "Hi," he replied, unable to look away. For a moment, neither of them said anything more. They just stared at each other, as if assessing how much they could trust one another. Finally, Charlotte turned to Philip and nodded, signaling him to leave. The lawyer stood up and left them alone on the bench, the wind rustling the leaves around them. "Philip told me a bit about your story," Charlotte began, breaking the silence. "I know what you're trying to do, and I know you probably think you can confront William alone. But you can't." Her words were direct, almost harsh. "If you go down that path, you'll end up destroyed, like many others before you." Ethan frowned, feeling a wave of pent-up anger. Who was she to tell him what he could or couldn't do? "You don't know me," he shot back coldly, "and you don't know what I'm capable of." Charlotte looked at him calmly, as if she had expected that reaction. Then, slowly, She rolled up her sleeve, revealing thin, pale scars that crisscrossed along her forearm. Ethan gasped, taken aback. "No, I don't know you," she said, her tone softer now. "But I know what it feels like to be crushed by someone who feeds on your pain." She paused, pulling her sleeve down again. "William almost destroyed me. He made me believe I was worthless, that I would never escape his control. But I escaped. And if I'm going to help you, you first need to understand that this isn't just about strength. It's about intelligence, patience, hitting where it hurts the most." Ethan felt the tension ease slightly in his chest. He had been so blinded by rage and the desire to confront William that he hadn't considered the deeper implications. But now, seeing Charlotte and hearing her story, something inside him began to change. "How did you do it?" he asked quietly, genuinely curious. "How did you manage to escape?" Charlotte smiled, but there was no joy in her expression, only determination. "By gathering evidence," she replied. "I waited, I observed, I recorded conversations, kept documents, tracked his movements. I made him believe he had me under control until I found the opportunity to leave. And then I left." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "But I've never stopped fighting against him." The conversation stretched on for hours. Charlotte told him how she met William, how she felt trapped in his web of lies and manipulation, and how even after escaping, the emotional aftermath continued to haunt her. Ethan, in turn, shared about his mother, the pain of being abandoned, and how the search for answers had consumed his life. "Your mother isn't to blame," Charlotte said at one point, her voice soft but firm. "She was trapped, like I was, and like other women before her." Ethan felt a knot in his throat. For so long, he had carried that resentment, that anger towards his mother, blaming her for every blow life had dealt him. But now, listening to Charlotte, he began to see the truth. Perhaps his mother hadn't abandoned him by choice. Perhaps she believed it was the only thing she could do to protect him. "So, will you help me?" he finally asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and doubt. Charlotte looked at him intently, evaluating him. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll help you. But you have to promise me something." "What?" "You won't let hate consume you. We're not doing this for revenge. We're doing this to free her." Her voice was strong and clear. "Because if you focus solely on destroying William, you'll lose sight of what really matters." Ethan pressed his lips together. The idea of giving up revenge filled him with frustration, but Charlotte was right. If he wanted to save his mother, he couldn't let anger blind him. "I promise," he finally murmured. Charlotte smiled, and in that moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. They had formed an alliance, built on shared pain and a common enemy. Together, they would begin to unravel the threads of the web that William had woven for years. But this time, Ethan wouldn't be alone. This time, he had someone who understood him, someone who would fight by his side. And for the first time in a long while, he believed they could win. The city lights flickered in the distance as Ethan stared at the mansion from the darkness of the park across the street. His heart raced, his hands sweating, and the nervousness that had kept him standing for the past few hours began to transform into pure adrenaline. For days, he and Charlotte had followed William's every move, watching from the shadows, tracing his steps and uncovering his patterns. But tonight was different. Tonight, Ethan wasn't just spying on William. Tonight, he was going to see his mother. The discovery that Helen was still under William's control had been a devastating blow. For years, he had imagined her living her life without him, perhaps with a new family, maybe even happy. But knowing that she had been trapped in an emotional prison, watched and controlled by the same man who had forced her to abandon him, that filled him with a dull rage, so intense he could barely contain it. "Are you ready?" Charlotte whispered. She was by his side, her face illuminated by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. They had spent hours planning this moment. Over the past few days, Charlotte had used her knowledge of William's security system to find a weak point, a small window of time when Helen would be alone, without the constant watch of guards. Ethan nodded slowly, jaw clenched. "I'm ready," he said, even though he wasn't sure of anything. "Remember," Charlotte insisted, placing a hand on his arm, "we don't know how she's going to react. It's been many years. She might not be like you remember." Ethan turned his gaze toward the mansion. He knew Charlotte was right, but he couldn't help but picture her as he remembered. A woman with a warm smile and eyes full of tenderness. The kind of mother who would hug him at night and whisper bedtime stories. But that woman had vanished the day she left him at the orphanage. The woman he was about to see tonight was a stranger. "I'm going to talk to her." Ethan clenched his fists tightly. "I just need to know why." Charlotte nodded, though her eyes reflected concern. "I'll be waiting here. If anything goes wrong, just let me know. Don't try to confront William if he shows up." "Not yet." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. He turned and crossed the street with firm steps, feeling the weight of the past and the future pressing on his shoulders. The tall walls and the closed gate didn't deter him. He had found a secondary access point through the backyard, a small gap between the security fence and the dense foliage. He slipped through the shadows, holding his breath. The backyard was silent. Only the faint murmur of the fountain and the wind whispering through the trees could be heard. Ethan moved stealthily, following the stone path until he reached the terrace. The mansion loomed impressively, with enormous windows and heavy curtains hiding the interior. But one of the second-floor windows was slightly ajar, and the lights in the room glowed softly. It was Helen's room. With his heart about to burst, Ethan approached. His feet crunched softly on the gravel, but he didn't stop. He reached the edge of the terrace and stretched, using his agility to climb the stone wall and reach the windowsill. He gripped it tightly, and with one final effort, propelled himself up, slipping into the room. There she was. Helen stood by a large window, her back to him. Her hair, which he remembered as dark and shiny, now had silver strands and was tied up in a loose bun. She wore a simple blouse and linen pants, and her posture reflected fatigue. There was something fragile about her that almost made him step back. But at the same time, the determination that had brought him there pushed him forward. "Mom," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Helen turned abruptly, her eyes widening with surprise and fear. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. They stared at each other, two strangers bound by a shattered past. Ethan saw her lips tremble, her hands gripping the edge of the table beside her to keep from falling. "Ethan," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The sound of his name on his mother's lips hit him like a storm of repressed emotions. Hatred, sadness, hope. Everything mixed in his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Yes, it's me," he murmured, taking a step toward her. But Helen instinctively recoiled, her expression shifting from surprise to panic. She raised a hand, as if wanting to keep him at bay. "You can't be here. You shouldn't be here." Helen's voice broke, and her gaze began to dart around the room, as if searching for an escape. "If William sees you, you have to leave." Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest. She didn't step forward to hug him, didn't smile or cry with joy. There was only fear. Fear of him. Fear of what his presence meant. "Why?" he asked, his voice filled with anguish. "Why did you leave me?" Helen pressed her lips together, trembling. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, but she didn't take a step toward him. She remained still, as if any movement could break her. I didn't want to," she whispered, her voice cracking with each word. "William, he forced me, made me think it was best for you, that you would be better off without me." "Better off without you," Ethan repeated, feeling the anger begin to rise again. "You left me alone. I spent years wondering what I did wrong, thinking I wasn't enough for you to stay. And all that time, you were with him, letting that monster manipulate you. Tears began to gather in his own eyes, but he held them back. Tell me, Mom, why didn't you come back for me? You had to come back. Helen closed her eyes, tears falling freely now. Her hands clutched the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I couldn't, she repeated through sobs. William controlled me. He made me believe that if I returned to you, I would hurt you. He told me to forget you, that you were a burden in my life. Ethan took a step back, feeling his world sway. That was the reason. For years, he had imagined thousands of motives, told himself that maybe his mother never loved him, that perhaps she never really wanted him. But hearing her say she was manipulated, that she was forced to believe he was a danger, that broke him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Ethan swallowed hard, struggling to stay upright. And what about now? He murmured, his voice trembling. Why are you still with him? Helen slowly opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze filled with deep pain and a fear that left him frozen. Because if I try to leave, if I try to escape, he promised he would find you. Her voice was barely a whisper. And he would kill you. Ethan felt rage boiling over inside him. He wanted to scream, to destroy everything around him, but he forced himself to calm down. Because this wasn't about his anger. It was about his mother. She had been a prisoner of William all this time, not just physically, but emotionally. And now that he saw her again, he understood that it wasn't enough to take down William. He needed to free Helen from the prison he had locked her in. I'll get you out of here, he said firmly, stepping closer. I promise you, Mom. I'm going to save you. Helen looked at him desperately. You can't confront him, Ethan. He's more dangerous than you think. Ethan shook his head. I'm not alone. Not this time. Helen looked at him, confused, but before she could say anything else, a noise came from the door. They both froze. Ethan, you have to. Leave, Helen whispered frantically. Now! Ethan knew he couldn't risk being discovered. He shot her one last look, heartbroken, and then back toward the window. I'll come back for you, he promised, his voice trembling. No matter what happens, I'll get you out of here. Helen looked at him with tears in her eyes, nodding slowly. I love you, Ethan, she murmured. I never stopped loving you. Ethan jumped through the window and disappeared into the shadows of the garden, while his mother remained alone in the room, embraced by fear and hope. The fluorescent lights of Philip's small office flickered slightly, casting irregular shadows on the walls covered with documents and photographs. Ethan sat in front of a corkboard that stretched from one side of the room to the other, with dozens of papers, newspaper clippings, and photographs connected by red threads. The map of William's web of influence was both impressive and terrifying. He had connections in the business world, ties to local police, and even a presence in judicial circles. Every new piece of information they added made the web seem more indestructible. Charlotte stood beside him, arms crossed and face tense. She hadn't said much since the night Ethan confronted his mother. She had seen the pain and desperation in Helen's eyes, and it had affected her more than she wanted to admit. She knew they were entering dangerous territory. William would stop at nothing to maintain control over Helen and Ethan, and they needed to be smarter than him. If we're going to do this, we need something stronger, Charlotte murmured, breaking the silence. Philip looked up from the table where he was reviewing a stack of legal documents. Stronger, he repeated, frowning. William doesn't just control Helen emotionally, she explained. He has real, tangible power. We need concrete evidence that he's been breaking the law, something that directly incriminates him and that he can't easily dispose of. She turned to Ethan. We need to go beyond what we've done so far. Ethan gritted his teeth, feeling the tension in every muscle of his body. The night he saw his mother had been a mix of pain and despair. He had left with the promise to return for her, But he knew that words weren't enough. William had absolute control over Helen, and to break that control, it wasn't enough to physically free her. They had to destroy William, strip him of the power he wielded over her, and expose him to everyone. "What do you suggest?" Philip asked, rising from his chair. Charlotte approached the corkboard and pointed to a name in the corner of the diagram, a name that until that moment had been just another detail among many. Victor Bennett. "He's the key," she said with conviction. "Bennett has worked for William for years as his right-hand man. He handles his shady businesses and ensures that everything illegal stays off the radar. If we can get him to talk, we could dismantle the entire operation from within." Philip shook his head, frowning. "Bennett is loyal to William. He would never talk." "Unless he has a reason to," Charlotte replied, a faint, grim smile on her face. "I've been researching. Bennett has a son who's struggling with severe addiction and is in trouble with the law. If we press him with this, we could get him to cooperate. All we need is enough information to approach him and convince him that it's better to betray William than to stay by his side." Ethan felt a spark of hope ignite within him. For weeks, they had tried to find a weak point in William's armor, and so far, all their moves had seemed insignificant against the man's power. But Bennett, if they could get him to talk, if they could gather evidence proving that William had been operating outside the law, they could tear down his facade. "And how are we going to approach him?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. Charlotte looked at Philip with determination. "I've already done it. I know an old contact who owes me a favor. He can arrange a meeting with Bennett. It'll be risky, but it's our best shot." Philip looked at her skeptically, but then sighed. "Then let's do it." The meeting place was an abandoned warehouse in the city's industrial district. The night was dark, and the streetlights nearby flickered irregularly, casting unsettling shadows on the brick walls. Charlotte, Ethan, and Philip arrived in a car with no lights, parking a block away. The silence that surrounded them was almost suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of a passing train. "Are you sure about this?" Charlotte asked quietly, looking him in the eyes. Ethan nodded, unwavering. "Yes. If this man can help us destroy William, I'll do whatever it takes to convince him." They exchanged silent glances, and then Charlotte turned toward the warehouse door. "All right, follow my lead. Let's not do anything that might make Bennett feel threatened. He's our only card right now." They entered the warehouse through a side door, moving cautiously through the shadows. The bare walls and broken windows echoed with every step they took. In the back, a solitary figure waited by a metal table. Victor Bennett, a middle-aged man with graying hair and weathered skin, looked at them with pure distrust. "You have 5 minutes to tell me why I shouldn't kill you right here," he growled, narrowing his eyes. Charlotte raised her hands, showing calm. "We're not here to cause you trouble, Bennett. We're here because we want to help you." The man let out a dry laugh. "Help me? And why would I need your help?" Charlotte stepped forward, her tone softer. "Because I know your son is in trouble," she said gently. "And I know William won't lift a finger to help him. But we will. If you give us the information we need, I promise we'll keep your son safe. We'll take care of his legal issues and give him a second chance." She paused, letting the words sink in. "William will abandon you as soon as you stop being useful to him. But we can offer you an escape." Bennett studied her with narrowed eyes, his hands trembling slightly on the table. Ethan watched every small movement, seeing how the man processed what Charlotte was saying. There was fear in his gaze, but also a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe there was a way to save his son. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan stepped forward, his heart racing. "We want William. We need proof of his illegal dealings, of how he's been manipulating people. We know you have access to all that information, and if you give it to us, we promise we won't just keep your son safe, but you as well." Bennett pressed his lips together, lowering his gaze. The tension in the air was palpable. Ethan could almost hear the ticking of the clock, each second stretching as the man wrestled with himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bennett nodded slowly. "I have files, emails, financial documents, recordings, everything you need to bury him. But if he catches me..." Bennett looked up, fear shining clearly in his eyes. "If he catches me, not just me, he'll kill my son." Ethan felt a knot form in his throat. He knew what it was like to feel that kind of fear, the fear of losing someone you love. He stepped closer and placed a hand on the table. "I promise," he said firmly, "we won't let that happen. But we need that evidence. It's our only chance to save my mother and take down William for good." Bennett stared at him, his eyes gleaming with a mix of doubt and desperation. But finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right, I'll give you what you need." Ethan felt his heart race. They had done it. For the first time, they had something real against William, something that could destroy him. "I'll send you everything tomorrow," Bennett said. "But this doesn't change anything. If William suspects anything, we're dead." Charlotte smiled faintly. "Don't worry. We'll make sure everything is done perfectly. And when he falls, you and your son will be safe." Bennett nodded, his gaze still heavy with fear. But Ethan knew they had taken the first major step toward taking down William. The plan for justice was in motion, and there was no turning back. The rain battered the city as if it wanted to wash away all its sins. The drops fell heavily, hitting the windshield of the car where Ethan, Charlotte, and Philip waited in silence. The outside world was a blur of lights and shadows under the downpour, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and anticipation. This was the night they had been waiting for weeks, the night when everything they had planned would set in motion. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Philip asked, breaking the silence. His dark eyes searched Ethan's for any sign of doubt. "I am," Ethan replied firmly, staring at the imposing mansion of William across the street. Bennett had given them everything they needed: documents, emails, recordings, and detailed financial records linking William to illegal activities, from money laundering to manipulation of government contracts. But the most important piece was a secretly recorded video by Bennett, a conversation in which William admitted to using Helen for his own purposes and manipulating others to maintain his control. That recording was the irrefutable proof of William's crimes. But more importantly, it showed his true face, a ruthless man who saw people as pawns. That video would not only be his downfall, it would be his public humiliation. The plan was perfectly designed. They had to enter the mansion and activate the transmission system that Charlotte had prepared. The video would be streamed live across various online platforms, exposing William to all his partners and contacts. They wouldn't just destroy him legally, they would destroy him socially, dismantling his entire network of influence and power. "Do you know what the signal is, right?" Philip insisted, as if he needed to hear the confirmation one more time. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes. When the garden lights flicker twice, it means Charlotte is inside and everything is ready." The plan required precision. Charlotte, with her skills for infiltration, had gained access to the mansion's security systems. Now she had to disable the alarms, open the doors for Ethan and Philip, and then head to the server room where they would upload the video. Everything depended on each step being executed perfectly. One mistake, and William would know they were there. And if that happened, it would all end in disaster. "It's time." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper as he saw the garden lights flicker twice. Philip inhaled deeply and nodded. "Then let's go." They exited the car under the rain, the hoods of their coats covering their faces. They moved quickly, crossing the street and staying in the shadows as they reached the back entrance of the mansion. Charlotte had left the garden door open, just as they had planned. Ethan pushed it slowly, holding his breath as they entered. The interior of the mansion was dark, with only a few dim lights in the hallways. The distant rumble of thunder echoed through the place, adding a touch of unease to the atmosphere. They moved carefully, climbing the stairs to the second floor, where the server room was located. "Everything's quiet so far," Philip murmured, almost inaudibly. Ethan nodded, his heart racing. Each step brought them closer to William, and with every passing second, he felt the walls closing in around him. But they couldn't stop. Not now. When they finally reached the door of the server room, Charlotte was already waiting for them. Her face was covered in raindrops, and wet strands of hair clung to her forehead, but her gaze was resolute. "Everything is ready," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan and Charlotte exchanged glances, and he felt a wave of gratitude toward her. They had come so far, all thanks to the determination they shared. He allowed himself a brief moment to take her hand and squeeze it gently. "Thank you," he murmured. Charlotte smiled wryly, her expression still tense. "Don't thank me yet. We're not done." She opened the door to the server room, and the three of them slipped inside. The room was filled with cables and screens, all blinking with colored lights. Charlotte approached the main console and connected a small device she had brought with her. The screen in front of them lit up with an unfamiliar interface, displaying the recordings and files that Bennett had provided. "This is it," Charlotte said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "As soon as we upload this, there's no turning back." Ethan looked at the screen with a mix of fear and determination. The cursor blinked, waiting for the final command to start the live transmission. "Do it," he said, his voice firm. Charlotte pressed a couple of keys, and suddenly the screens in the room filled with the video. The recording began to play live, streaming to all of William's contacts, emails, and social media accounts. They could see William sitting in his office, with Bennett across the table. "She means nothing," William said in a harsh voice, referring to Helen. "She was only useful to keep the boy out of the way. Once she was alone, she became a burden. But I always knew how to control her." A cruel smile formed on his lips. "And if anyone tries to take her from me, they'll regret it." The words resonated with a coldness that chilled the soul. Charlotte gritted her teeth, and Ethan felt a wave of rage mixed with satisfaction as he watched the true William be exposed. In the recording, William continued speaking, detailing how he had manipulated Helen, using her fear and love for her son against her. "If she tries to escape again, I can make that boy's life a hell," he said with a soft laugh. "And if he dies in the process, I'll play the grieving father. No one will point fingers at me. No one." His words dripped with a poison that slowly revealed the extent of his cruelty. Ethan felt his entire body tense as he heard those words. He had feared that William was a monster, but seeing this confirmation was different. He wasn't just a cruel man. He was a sociopath who saw people as objects, who used others' love and desperation for his own benefit. "It's done," Charlotte whispered, her hands trembling as the video continued to stream. "Everyone will see this." But at that moment, a dull noise echoed behind them. The three turned in unison and saw the door swing open. William stood there, flanked by two armed guards. "Well, well," William said with a chilling smile, his dark, dangerous eyes glinting. "Look what we have here." Charlotte held her breath, taking a step back. Philip instinctively raised his hands, but Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, staring at him. "I thought you'd take a bit longer to cause me trouble, but it seems I underestimated the desperation of failures," William continued, his tone mocking. Ethan felt something ignite within him, a fire he had been holding back for so long. He stepped toward William, locking eyes with him. "This ends now, William," he said firmly. "Everyone is watching what you really are. You can't hide anymore." For a moment, William's smile faltered, but then he quickly recovered, stepping forward. "Do you really think I care what people think?" he chuckled softly. "This video won't change anything. My contacts, my network, everything will remain the same. And you, boy, you will pay for this. You and that poor woman you call mother." Ethan didn't let himself be intimidated. "No, William," Ethan replied, his voice low but firm. This time, it will be you who loses." At that moment, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The guards next to William exchanged nervous glances, and for the first time, Ethan saw a spark of concern in William's eyes. "What?" he began to say. But then Charlotte raised her phone, showing him the screen. "I sent the location to the police before we arrived," she said with a cold smile. "They're on their way." William's eyes widened in fury as he stepped toward them. But before he could do anything, the mansion's lights went out and then flickered back on, and the police stormed into the building. "Police! Hands up!" Chaos erupted in the server room, but Ethan only had eyes for William. The man who had ruined his life, who had manipulated and tortured his mother, was finally falling. And this time, there was no way he was getting back up. The sound of sirens and shouting orders filled the mansion as police officers burst in through every entrance. Their footsteps echoed like thunder through the hallways, and the flashlights swept over every corner of the dark rooms. The security guards accompanying William froze for a moment, exchanging nervous glances before dropping their weapons and raising their hands in panic. William stood motionless in the center of the server room, his jaw clenched and his eyes flashing with fury. Shadows of fear passed quickly across his face, but they dissolved almost instantly, replaced by a cold and dangerous smile. "Do you really think this is going to change anything?" His voice came out mockingly, even amid the chaos. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Ethan stared at him, feeling the anger boil inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Beside him, Charlotte and Philip also remained silent, watching as the police officers moved around them, pointing their flashlights and weapons. "Everyone on the ground!" shouted one officer, and the guards immediately knelt down, leaving William standing like a dethroned king refusing to bow. "I'm not going anywhere," William muttered, a smug smile on his face. "Do you really think you can catch me with a few manipulated pieces of evidence?" Ethan stepped forward, looking directly into William's eyes. The man who had been a dark shadow in his life for so many years was finally within reach, and this time he wouldn't let himself be intimidated. "It's not just manipulated evidence, William," he said firmly, keeping his gaze locked on him. "It's everything you've done, everything you've hidden, and now everyone knows." William narrowed his eyes, his expression hardening. "You think you're going to destroy me with that?" He gestured toward the screen behind him, where the video transmission was still ongoing. "But you're mistaken, boy. People forget. My contacts, my partners, they're already moving. Everything will go back to normal. And when this calms down, you and your lot will pay dearly for what you've done." But then, a figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. Helen. Ethan felt his heart stop as he saw his mother slowly advance toward them, her face streaked with tears and her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. The police hesitated, but seeing that she posed no threat, they let her pass. Her gaze was fixed on William, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination that made Ethan feel a knot in his throat. "No," Helen said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This time, you won't get away with it, William." William turned to her with disbelief, his eyes wide open. For a moment, he seemed unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "Helen," he whispered, as if her presence were a bad dream he hoped to wake up from. "What are you doing?" "I'm putting an end to this." Helen took a step forward, trembling, but she didn't stop. "For years, I let you manipulate me. I let you control every part of my life. But no more. I won't let you continue destroying the people I love." William stepped toward her, his hand outstretched, as if trying to calm her, as if he still thought he could make her fall back under his control. "Helen, darling, you don't understand what you're doing. All of this, they're using you. They're the ones who want to destroy us." His voice was soft, almost convincing. "You can't trust them. I'm the only one who has always been by your side. Don't you understand?" But Helen shook her head, her eyes locked on William's. No, William. You're the one who destroyed everything. You're the only one to blame for what happened. She turned to Ethan, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. And my son. My son should never have paid the price for my mistakes. Ethan felt a knot in his throat, but he didn't say anything. He knew this was Helen's moment, the moment when she was taking control of her life for the first time in a long time. And what do you think will happen now, Helen? William's voice hardened, and the glint of danger returned to his eyes. Do you think you can stop me? His words dripped with venom. You can't. Neither you nor that kid. If I fall, I'll take everyone down with me. At that moment, one of the officers stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. William Donovan, you're under arrest for multiple charges of fraud, corruption, emotional coercion, and abuse. You have the right to remain silent. But before he could finish, William let out a harsh laugh. Fraud? Corruption? William looked at Ethan and Helen, his eyes burning with fury. This isn't the end. Not while I have loyal people by my side. His gaze locked onto Ethan. I promise you'll pay for this. I never lose. But then Helen took a step closer to him, confronting him directly. Not this time, William, she said firmly. This time, you will lose everything. In that moment, Ethan saw something break in William's gaze. The certainty, the arrogance that had always been his trademark crumbled. For the first time, he realized he had lost control. Helen was no longer his prisoner, and if she could free herself, everything else would also come crashing down. Take him away, the officer ordered, and the guards stepped forward to restrain William. He struggled, cursing and shouting, but he no longer had the power he once wielded. As they dragged him away, his gaze never left Ethan. There was pure hatred in his eyes, a promise of revenge that had not yet died. But Ethan didn't back down. He stared back at him, filled with a determination he had never felt before. William vanished from sight, escorted by the police, and the chaos in the mansion began to calm. The security guards were detained, and the officers started searching the property for further evidence. But at the center of it all, in the small server room, Ethan and Helen remained silent. Charlotte approached slowly, her face tense but a soft smile on her lips. We did it, she said softly. Ethan nodded, but his gaze was fixed on his mother. Helen stepped toward him, tears still streaming down her cheeks. Ethan, I'm so sorry. Her voice broke, and her face reflected all the pain and guilt of the lost years. I'm sorry for leaving you, for not fighting harder for you. She tried to touch his face but hesitated, her hand trembling. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Ethan felt the weight of the past few years crash down on him. The words of hatred he had harbored, the nights he had cursed her, all the times he wished he had never known her, all of it mixed with the pain and hope of finally seeing her free. Mom, he whispered, his voice barely a murmur, and then he hugged her, tight, as if fearing that if he let go, she would disappear again. Helen clung to him, sobbing silently. I promise I will never leave you again, she whispered through her tears. Never again. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her embrace and the tears burning his cheeks. I know, he murmured. Now we are free. The sounds of sirens and police voices faded around them. In that moment, all that mattered was that, after so long, he and his mother were finally together. They had won. William had fallen. But for Ethan, the real victory was much simpler. He had finally regained the only family he had ever wanted. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers as Helen took the stand. The camera lights flashed incessantly while murmurs filled the room. Ethan sat in the back rows, with Charlotte by his side, and Philip at the front, carefully reviewing each document and taking notes. The trial against William had begun, and today Helen was going to testify. William, now with a weary appearance and handcuffs glinting on his wrists, sat next to his lawyers at the defense table. The man who had once been imposing and controlling now seemed smaller, his face hardened by tension. But even so, his gaze remained filled with hatred when it landed on Helen and Ethan. The judge gently rapped his gavel, calling the room to order. "Ms. Helen Matthews, please proceed," the judge said in a grave voice. Helen nodded slowly, her gaze fixed ahead. She took a deep breath before beginning to speak, and Ethan felt the air around him grow denser. "My name is Helen Matthews. I met William over 20 years ago when I was going through a very difficult time in my life. He appeared as a savior, offering me support and comfort. Or so I thought back then." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. But soon I realized it wasn't like that. William wasn't helping me, he was isolating me. He used my fears and insecurities to manipulate me, and over time, I realized that I had become his emotional prisoner. A murmur ran through the room, but Helen continued, her voice stronger now. "When I had my son, Ethan, I thought everything would change. I thought I would find the strength to fight. But he..." She paused, swallowing hard. "William made me believe that Ethan was an obstacle, that if I wanted to protect him, I had to let him go. He made me choose between my son and my own survival. And I made the mistake of listening to him." Helen looked at William with a mix of pain and determination. "But no more. Today, I am here to tell the truth, no matter how much he tries to hide behind his web of lies and threats. William Donovan is a manipulator, an abuser, and he must pay for what he has done." Ethan felt a mix of pride and sadness as he listened to his mother. Seeing her there, facing her own fears and exposing William to everyone, was something he had never imagined. For so many years, he had seen her as a victim, a broken woman trapped in her own despair. But now, Helen was proving to be much stronger than anyone had believed. The trial continued for hours. William's lawyers tried to discredit Helen, insinuating that everything was a fabrication, that she was only seeking revenge. But every time they attacked, Philip stood up with compelling evidence: Bennett's recordings, the financial documents, the statements from other witnesses who had begun to surface after William's fall. Each new testimony was like another blow, gradually dismantling the defense of the man who once thought he was untouchable. Finally, it was Ethan's turn. When the judge called him to the stand, he felt a chill run down his spine. But when he looked at Charlotte, she gave him an encouraging smile. He took a deep breath and walked forward with steady steps, taking his seat before the court. "Ethan Matthews, can you tell us about your experience with the defendant?" the prosecutor asked in a calm tone. Ethan nodded slowly, searching for the right words. "I never met William personally until recently," he began softly. "But somehow, he has been present in my life for as long as I can remember. When I was a child, my mother left me at an orphanage. I spent years wondering why, thinking I wasn't enough, that I wasn't good enough for her to want to stay with me." He paused, feeling the weight of years of accumulated pain. "But now I know it wasn't her fault. William made sure I grew up feeling like a burden, that I would never be loved, and that shattered me." The silence in the room was absolute. William watched him with narrowed eyes, his expression as cold as ice. As time passed, that wound turned into anger. I thought if I found him, if I destroyed him, all my pain would disappear. But what I discovered was something deeper. Ethan turned to Helen, who was sitting on the other side of the room, her eyes filled with tears. "I discovered that true power doesn't lie in revenge. It lies in truth. And the truth is that he can't control us anymore." He raised his voice slightly, addressing William with an intensity that made the entire court shudder. "You have no power over us. Never again." William snorted from his seat, but said nothing. He had lost, and they both knew it. The final verdict came that same afternoon. The judge declared William guilty on all charges. The sentence was firm: life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. When the judge's gavel fell, a collective sigh swept through the room. It was over. The man who had tormented them for so many years had finally been defeated. Ethan felt his legs tremble as he stood up from his seat. He had imagined this moment so many times. William's fall, his ultimate defeat. But now that it had arrived, all he felt was relief. Not euphoria, not triumph. Just relief. As if a heavy burden he had carried his entire life had finally been lifted. "We did it," Charlotte murmured beside him, her voice breaking with emotion. Ethan looked at her and nodded slowly, feeling a smile form on his lips. "Yes, we did." But their true victory was still to come. That night, as they left the courthouse, Helen approached him. The moon shone in the clear sky, and the air was fresh and clean after the storm of the trial. "Ethan," she said softly, stopping a few steps away from him, "would you like to come with me?" Her eyes reflected the same mix of pain and hope he had seen in them the first night he found her again. Ethan felt his heart race. For so long, he had dreamed of this possibility, the idea that one day he and his mother could be together again. But he also knew there were many wounds to heal, many words that still needed to be spoken. "Yes," he finally replied, his voice trembling with emotion. "I would love to." Tears filled Helen's eyes as she stepped closer and hugged him tightly. This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. He held her in his arms, closing his eyes and allowing himself for the first time in many years to feel true peace. The fall of William had been just the first step, but now he and his mother had the chance to rebuild their lives. Together. One day at a time. Charlotte approached, smiling gently, and Ethan reached out a hand to her. The three of them stood there under the moonlight, knowing that although the path would be long and filled with challenges, they would face it together. Finally, after so many years of pain and darkness, the future belonged to them. A new beginning. Thank you for joining us in this intense story of struggle, redemption, and justice. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more emotionally charged stories. Remember, in life, there is always a new beginning. See you next time.